Section 14 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. M.L. Cohen, Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 4 by Henry Gray. The Fore-brain, Part 2. The telencephalon. The telencephalon includes 1. The cerebral hemispheres with their cavities, the lateral ventricles, and 2. The pars optica hypothalami, and the anterior portion of the third ventricle, already described under the diencephalon. As previously stated, each cerebral hemisphere may be divided into 3 fundamental parts, that is, the rhinencephalon, the corpus striatum, and the neopallium. The rhinencephalon, associated with the sense of smell, is the oldest part of the telencephalon and forms almost the whole of the hemisphere in some of the lower animals, that is, fishes, amphibians, and reptiles. In man, it is rudimentary, whereas the neopallium undergoes great development and forms the chief part of the hemisphere. The cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres constitute the largest part of the brain and, when viewed together from above, assume the form of an ovoid mass broader behind than in front, the greatest transverse diameter corresponding with the line connecting the 2 parietal eminences. The hemispheres are separated medially by a deep cleft termed a longitudinal cerebral fissure, and each possesses a central cavity, the lateral ventricle. The longitudinal cerebral fissure, Fissura cerebri longitudinalis, great longitudinal fissure, contains a sickle-shaped process of dura mater, the falx cerebri. In front and behind, the fissure extends from the upper to the under surfaces of the hemispheres and completely separates them, but its middle portion separates them for only about 1/2 of their vertical extent, for at this part they are connected across the middle line by a great central white commissure, the corpus callosum. In a median sagittal section, the cut corpus callosum presents the appearance of a broad arched band. Its thick posterior end, termed a splenium, overlaps the midbrain but is separated from it by the telechoroidea of the third ventricle and the pineal body. Its anterior curved end, termed the genu, gradually tapers into a thinner portion, the rostrum, which is continued downward and backward in front of the anterior commissure to join the lamina terminalis. Arching backward from immediately behind the anterior commissure to the undersurface of the splenium is a second white band named the fornix. Between this and the corpus callosum are the laminae and cavity of the septum pellucidum. Surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres. Each hemisphere presents 3 surfaces, lateral, medial, and inferior. The lateral surface is convex in adaptation to the concavity of the corresponding half of the vault of the cranium. The medial surface is flat and vertical and is separated from that of the opposite hemisphere by the great longitudinal fissure and the falx cerebri. The inferior surface is of an irregular form and may be divided into 3 areas, anterior, middle, and posterior. The anterior area, formed by the orbital surface of the frontal lobe, is concave and rests on the roof of the orbit and nose. The middle area is convex and consists of the undersurface of the temporal lobe. It is adapted to the corresponding half of the middle cranial fossa. The posterior area is concave, directed medialward as well as downward, and is termed the tentorial surface, since it rests upon the tentorium cerebelli, which intervenes between it and the upper surface of the cerebellum. These 3 surfaces are separated from each other by the following borders: A. Superior medial between the lateral and medial surfaces. B. Inferior lateral between the lateral and inferior surfaces. The anterior part of this border separating the lateral from the orbital surface is known as the superciliary border. C. Medial occipital, separating the medial and tentorial surfaces, and D. Medial orbital, separating the orbital from the medial surface. The anterior end of the hemisphere is named the frontal pole, the posterior the occipital pole, and the anterior end of the temporal lobe the temporal pole. About 5 centimeters in front of the occipital pole on the inferior lateral border is an indentation or notch named the preoccipital notch. The surfaces of the hemispheres are molded into a number of irregular eminences named gyri or convolutions, and separated by furrows termed fissures and sulci. The furrows are of 2 kinds, complete and incomplete. The former appear earlier in fetal life, are few in number, and are produced by infoldings of the entire thickness of the brain wall and give rise to the corresponding elevations in the interior of the ventricle. They comprise the hippocampal fissure and parts of the calcarine and collateral fissures. The incomplete furrows are very numerous and only indent the subjacent white substance without producing any corresponding elevations in the ventricular cavity. The gyri and their intervening fissures and the sulci are fairly constant in their arrangement. At the same time, they vary within certain limits, not only in different individuals, but on the two hemispheres of the same brain. The convoluted condition of the surface permits a great expansion of the gray matter without the sacrifice of much additional space. The number and extent of the gyri, as well as the depth of the intervening furrows, appear to bear a direct relation to the intellectual powers of the individual. Certain of the fissures and sulci are utilized for the purpose of dividing the hemisphere into lobes, and are therefore termed interlobular. Included under this category are the lateral cerebral, parietal occipital, calcarine, and collateral fissures, the central and cingulate sulci, and the sulcus circularis. The lateral cerebral fissure, fissura cerebri lateralis sylvii, fissure of Sylvius, is a well-marked cleft on the inferior and lateral surfaces of the hemisphere, and consists of a short stem which divides into 3 rami. The stem is situated at the base of the brain and commences in a depression at the lateral angle of the anterior perforated substance. From this point, it extends between the anterior part of the temporal lobe and the orbital surface of the frontal lobe, and reaches the lateral surface of the hemisphere. Here it divides into 3 rami, an anterior horizontal, an anterior ascending, and a posterior. The anterior horizontal ramus passes forward about 2.5 centimeters into the inferior frontal gyrus, while the anterior ascending ramus extends upward into the same convolution for about an equal distance. The posterior ramus is the longest. It runs backward and slightly upward for about 7 centimeters and ends by an upward inflection in the parietal lobe. The central sulcus, sulcus centralis Rolandi, fissure of Rolando, central fissure, is situated about the middle of the lateral surface of the hemisphere and begins in or near the longitudinal cerebral fissure, a little behind its midpoint. It runs sinuously downward and forward and ends a little above the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure, and about 2.5 centimeters behind the anterior ascending ramus of the same fissure. It described 2 chief curves, a superior genu with its concavity directed forward, and an inferior genu with its concavity directed backward. The central sulcus forms an angle opening forward of about 70 degrees with the median plane. The parieto-occipital fissure, fissura parietal occipitalis, only a small part of this fissure is seen on the lateral surface of the hemisphere, its chief part being on the medial surface. The lateral part of the parieto-occipital fissure is situated about 5 centimeters in front of the occipital pole of the hemisphere and measures about 1.25 centimeters in length. The medial part of the parietal occipital fissure runs downward and forward as a deep cleft on the medial surface of the hemisphere and joins the calcarine fissure below and behind the posterior end of the corpus callosum. In most cases, it contains a submerged gyrus. The calcarine fissure, fissura calcarina, is on the medial surface of the hemisphere. It begins near the occipital pole in 2 converging rami and runs forward to a point a little below the splenium of the corpus callosum, where it is joined at an acute angle by the medial part of the parietal occipital fissure. The anterior part of this fissure gives rise to the prominence of the calcar avus and the posterior cornule of the lateral ventricle. The cingulate sulcus, sulcus cinguli, callosum marginal fissure, is on the medial surface of the hemisphere. It begins below the anterior end of the corpus callosum and runs upward and forward nearly parallel to the rostrum of this body and, curving in front of the genu, is continued backward above the corpus callosum and finally ascends to the superior medial border of the hemisphere, a short distance behind the upper end of the central sulcus. It separates the superior frontal from the cingulate gyrus. The collateral fissure, fissura collateralis, is on the tentorial surface of the hemisphere and extends from near the occipital pole to within a short distance of the temporal pole. Behind, it lies below and lateral to the calcarine fissure, from which it is separated by the lingual gyrus. In front,